I'm Michael Martinez, and you're about to listen to an AI-generated discussion of my article, How Does Tolkien Depict Women in Middle-earth? This is a controversial topic, as many readers feel that J.R.R. Tolkien excluded women from important roles and adhered to classic stereotypes. I've always felt that he saw some of the shortcomings in his stories and that he sought to make adjustments to them. But he needed to find a balance between the myth-making and the character development. When the AI system generated this discussion the first time around, it wasn't always clear if the hosts were referring to my own views or Tolkien's. On the second pass, I prompted the system to be more clear and precise about which views in the article are mine. So you'll find that the hosts do mention me frequently, more than you might expect.
Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a topic that, it definitely gets people talking.
Oh, yeah.
The depiction of women in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth stories.
It's a big one, and you hear a lot of criticisms sometimes, don't you? Like, not enough major female characters, especially in, say, The Hobbit.
Exactly. Or questions about the kinds of roles they play when they're there. It can be pretty sensitive.
For sure.
So to help us navigate this, we're focusing today's deep dive on an article by Michael Martinez called How Does Tolkien Depict Women in Middle-earth?
And Martinez is someone who's, well, he's written a lot about this. This isn't his only piece on women in Tolkien's fiction. He's explored it from many angles in other articles, too.
That's a great point. He's clearly spent significant time thinking about it. And in this piece, he tackles those criticisms head on.
He does. The idea that The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings are just boy stories, the representation issues, potential bias, he addresses them directly.
So our mission here is to unpack how Martinez approaches this. What's his framework? How does he suggest we look at this whole, sometimes contentious subject?
Well, the core of his argument is that you can't just, throw all of Tolkien's work into one bucket for this question.
Okay.
He says you really need to look at it in three distinct categories because the fiction serves different purposes. It works in different ways.
Right, that makes sense. Different kinds of writing. So three categories. What's the first one he identifies?
So the first category is what Martinez calls Tolkien's mythological constructions. This is the deep stuff, the foundational myths.
Like the Book of Lost Tales, the material that became the Silmarillion.
Exactly. The ancient history, first age, all that. Martinez notes that, there are some really significant female figures in these myths. But the focus, especially in the big tragic stories, often lands on the male characters, particularly the flawed ones, the ones making terrible mistakes.
Interesting. Does he notice anything else about the women in these myths?
Yeah, he points out something quite striking. There's a real lack of sort of evil witches, with just one key exception, apparently.
Huh.
And Martinez suggests this might mean Tolkien didn't really associate women with evil in the same way he did men, not like you might see in some other mythologies he knew well.
And Martinez even offers his own interpretation, right, based on Tolkien's other notes.
He does. He says, look, Tolkien loved Greek and Norse myths, which do have some pretty fearsome female figures, evil ones even, but Tolkien seemed, in his own world building, to prefer what Martinez calls a more censored role for women.
Believing they were better caretakers.
Better caretakers of the best of human gifts than men. That's Martinez's reading of Tolkien's possible view, guiding those early creative choices. It's an interpretation, but a fascinating one.
Okay, so that's category one,
Yeah.
the deep mythology. What's the second category, according to Martinez?
Category 2 is very specific, The Hobbit, just The Hobbit. And Martinez's take here is pretty straightforward. He basically says, you have to remember how this book started. It was a story Tolkien told his young sons.
Literally for them, yeah. An adventure story.
Exactly. So Martinez argues it naturally followed a male hero, Bilbo, and his male group of companions because, well, boys typically like those kinds of stories. That was the intended audience.
And he draws a parallel to today, doesn't he? Pointing out that gendered marketing still happens.
He does. He mentions, princess stories aimed at girls. It still exists.
So acknowledging that bias might be there based on the audience.
Right. And then Martinez puts a question to us, to you listening. Given that context, should fiction be universally criticized for allowing those biases? Especially when they reflect who the story was originally for. It makes you think about context, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, context is key there. Now the third category. This must be the Lord of the Rings.
That's the one, and arguably the most complex and the one people discuss most often.
So what's Martinez's main point about the Lord of the Rings?
His argument here is that at some point in writing it, Tolkien made a conscious shift. a deliberate change to the narrative structure.
A change to do what?
To include strong female characters. Even if they weren't maybe the primary drivers of the main quest plot, he made sure they were there and had significant roles.
Why does Martinez think Tolkien did that? Any speculation?
Well, Martinez wonders if maybe because it started as a sequel to The Hobbit, it initially just followed that same male-focused pattern. The setting didn't seem to need women characters at first.
But then it grew into something much bigger.
Exactly. As it became what Martinez calls a more realistic interpretation of myth, Tolkien started weaving in women, and Martinez sees them serving roles you can recognize from, say, Greek literature or the Norse sagas, maybe with a touch of medieval romance thrown in too.
Okay, so this is where we get characters like Arwen, Galadriel, Éowyn.
Precisely. And Martinez discusses them individually. Let's take Arwen.
Often seen as a bit distant, maybe? And people criticize moving her story with Aragorn to the appendices.
Martinez definitely acknowledges that. He knows that's a common frustration for readers.
But he defends Tolkien's choice.
He does, interestingly. He suggests Tolkien probably made the right decision, narratively speaking. He argues her specific tale, the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, it just did not really fit with the primary narrative flow of The War of the Rings.
So the frustration is intentional.
That's Martinez's take. He says, the reader does better to feel frustration over Arwen's implied presence than to resent her being sidelined. Like her distance is part of the point, highlighting her sacrifice. It's a thought-provoking perspective.
It really is. Okay, what about Galadriel? She's often held up as the strong female character.
Oh, yeah. Martinez calls her a mover and shaker, someone powerful, even if she works mostly behind the scenes in Lord of the Rings. He highlights that famous moment with Frodo in the ring.
I passed the test.
I shall diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. Martinez points out that this hints at a private failing in her past.
And he connects that to the wider legendarium.
Right. Drawing on other texts, Martinez reminds us that Galadriel had actually rebelled against the Valar, the Powers, way back in the First Age, and for a long time she was forbidden to return to the West.
So her power and wisdom in Lord of the Rings aren't just inherent, they're hard-won, shaped by this deep, complex past.
Exactly. There's history and consequence behind her strength.
Then we have Éowyn. Martinez calls her possibly the most popular.
Among readers, yeah, he thinks so. He notes how she's often seen maybe as an abused or neglected foster daughter, maybe a bit of a plot device, you know.
Slay the Witch King, marry the prince, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the surface reading he acknowledges. And he mentions Tolkien tried to add more complexity to her motivations later, but Martinez concedes that within Lord of the Rings itself, she's still a relatively minor character compared to Frodo or Sam, just in terms of focus.
And he adds that thought about her story maybe working better on its own.
He does. He muses that her story might make a better romance if told on its own terms, suggesting maybe the main plot didn't give her story enough room to breathe fully.
Okay. And Martinez brings in one more major figure from the Silmarillion this time.
Yes, Luthien Tinuville. He notes she gets nearly universal acceptance as a powerful central female character.
And her story with Beren, how does he describe that?
He emphasizes how we hear it from afar in different ways. Poetry, mentions in chronicles, Aragorn singing it.
Right, it echoes through the ages.
It does. Martinez calls it one of the more complex and interesting stories of the First Age, and significantly, he compares it most closely to a Norse or Icelandic saga, where the hero and heroine are truly partners in facing immense challenges.
Okay, so we have these three categories, these different contexts. How does Martinez pull it all together in his conclusion? What's the big picture on women in Tolkien's work, according to him?
Well, he uses this evocative phrase. Women in Tolkien struggle to emerge from the latency of his creativity.
Latency?
Meaning, Martinez thinks Tolkien's primary creative drive, initially at least, was focused elsewhere. On building the myths for England, creating elves and hobbits, telling those big heroic tales, kind of Greek or Anglo-Saxon style.
But then later, or perhaps alongside that.
Somewhere in that process, Martinez argues, Tolkien chose to write about the tragedies of a few very notable women. He decided to explore their specific stories, their successes, their failures, each in what Martinez calls her own tale.
But Martinez adds a caveat, doesn't he, about how well those tales were presented.
He does. His final thought is a bit melancholic, maybe. He feels Tolkien may not have done the best job of promoting those stories. Maybe because they often weren't central to the most famous books.
And this leads to a really interesting, maybe counterintuitive point he makes about hobbits.
Yeah, this is quite the twist at the end. Martinez concludes that without hobbits, these amazing female characters we've been discussing, Luthien, Galadriel, even Éowyn, they probably would have been lost and forgotten by now.
Wow. Because The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were so popular.
That popularity is what led millions of readers to then explore the appendices, pick up the Silmarillion, dive into the deeper lore where many of these women truly shine or their full stories are told. The Hobbits opened the door.
So thinking about this deep dive into Martinez's article, what does all this mean for you listening right now? Why does this framework matter?
Well, I think Martinez's approach gives you a really valuable tool. Instead of just asking that simple question, are there enough women, which often leads to a dead end.
Right.
His 3 categories, the myths, the Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, they help you frame the discussion with much more nuance. It lets you consider the context of each work.
It shows that Tolkien wasn't just doing one thing across his entire life's work, right? His approach to female characters seems to have shifted, or at least varied, depending on what he was writing, why he was writing it, maybe who he was writing it for.
Exactly. So this perspective, Martinez's perspective, it offers a more, let's say, complex way to appreciate the different layers of the legendarium and the roles women play within them, sometimes limited, yes, but often very significant when you look closer, considering the context.
Okay, that wraps up our deep dive into Michael Martinez's perspective on women in Tolkien.
It definitely provides a lot to think about, moving beyond just the surface level takes sometimes.
Absolutely. And reflecting on Martinez's central idea that Tolkien's approach really differed between the myths, the Hobbit, and the Lord of the Rings. Here's something for you to consider. How does actually separating those works in your mind, thinking about their different origins and purposes, influence your perception of the female characters? Does understanding, say, the specific context of the Hobbit or the mythological roots of Galadriel's power change how you view them and their importance in the grand scheme of Middle-earth?
That's a great question to ponder. And if you want to explore this further, definitely seek out Martinez's article, How Does Tolkien Depict Women in Middle-earth? Plus, as we mentioned, he has other writings on the topic out there too for your own continued deep dive.